Welcome to Counterpoint. I'm Tanya Granick-Allen. Today we're going to be speaking about another country in the world of growing concern for us Canadians, Iran. There are roughly 200,000 people of Iranian origin living in Canada. 97,000 of those live in the GTA, the Greater Toronto Area, and about 46,000 in Metro Vancouver. In the past few years, many Iranians who come to Canada as tourists, guest workers, or international students have been applying for refugee status. That number is about 1 in 20. And is this a surprise? With growing unrest and human rights abuses in Iran, many Iranians are simply looking to get out. Think of the recent incident with Ukrainian Flight 752, which was downed by the Iranian government. 55 Canadians were aboard that flight. What measures have been taken, if any, by our government to hold the Iranian government to account? Well, Canadian Iranians aren't taking this lightly. They are speaking out and at great personal risk. Here to discuss the deteriorating situation to Iran and the consequences to Canadians are Shahram Golestaneh from the Iran Democratic Association and Narges Ghaffari, host and producer of Radio Ierawa in Ottawa. Thank you so much, Narges and Shahram, for joining me today for this discussion. I think we really welcome your thoughts in this conversation so that Canadians can understand more why this issue matters to them. Perhaps, Narges, I'll start with you. You're a known Canadian-Iranian dissenter. Why are you dissenting, and discuss what has happened as a consequence to you speaking out?
First of all, thank you for having me here. When I was in Iran, I wasn't involved in politics. I was very young, and it just didn't bother me what was going on around me, and I didn't care too much because of it. But when I left Iran, it just opened my eyes, and when I spoke to other people, other Iranians in exile, it opened my eyes to what is actually happening in Iran and what is happening for Iranian women especially. So I started to read a lot about the movement, if you will, and the protests of people. When I came to Canada, I noticed that the Iranian embassy here in Ottawa was trying to gather information regarding Iranian dissidents in this city, especially. I moved once from one place to another place. I hadn't even tell my closest friend my address. And one day I opened the door and I saw lots of books published in Iran. They were sent to my address in my house, and I was very frustrated. So as I started to establish the Radio Ierawa in 1995, I started to talk about the role of Iranian regime in Ottawa, and also the news regarding Iran. And I was telling people what was happening, and I started, and I still continue to do that. But personally, on April 22nd, 2019, my family member messaged me a few days earlier saying that he had a very important matter to discuss with me. So he called me, I think it was a Monday morning. He called me, and his breath, I've had conversation with him a lot of times, and I've never noticed that he wasn't, that he was nervous. He couldn't catch his breath, to tell you the truth. I think you could tell that someone was there with him when he was calling me. He had a message from the intelligence organization of the IRGC, which stands for Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, and he was conveying 4 options for me from them. One of the options was to stop my activities against the regime so no one gets hurt. The second was for me to return to Iran. The third was not to return to Iran and continue with my activism. I guess I would see what happens. And then the fourth option was that I would stay in Canada and cooperate with them.
My goodness. So, and this relative, yes, was he living in Iran when he called you, or he's in Canada?
He lives in Iran. He called me on the phone, and he was so nervous. I recorded actually our conversation without telling him. And if I play it for you, you could understand, even though you don't know the words, but you can understand how much pressure he was under when he was talking to me. He couldn't catch his breath. So as I said, I recorded this conversation and I decided to go public with it.
Wow, and that's definitely a very heroic and bold thing to do, given the threats that seemingly have been levied against you. And I think that's something Canadians may be unaware, that there are actually foreign operators and governments, allegedly in this case, both here and abroad, who are levying threats against Canadians. We're going to delve into this conversation just a little bit more when we return from this commercial break, so please stick around. Narges, you were sharing your story before the break, but I'd like to ask you, Shahram, do you know or have you experienced similar threats, or have you heard of similar stories here of Canadians being threatened by Iranians domestically and abroad?
Yes, first, thank you for having me as well. Definitely. And this story actually is not only from what Nrgis described. This is common among many Iranian dissidents living in Canada. I had heard the similar stories in various capacities, originating from either Iran or some of them originating from Canada with threatening voice. I have to give you a very recent example that has been also made public, and that was the spokesperson for the victims of the Flight 752 Ukrainian flights, who has been threatened. So this gentleman, who has already been grieving the loss of his wife and his daughter, now is being basically threatened. His life is in danger in Canada by people calling him either from Canada or from Iran. Unfortunately, he has stood up and he has taken it to the public, and he has taken it to the authorities, to the police and RCMP. But you can imagine when even a public figure like him is being threatened, then you can imagine other people definitely will have the same situation.
And again, I think Canadians are shocked to hear that this is happening here on our soil, that dissidents are being threatened like this. Narges, what made you make this public? Like, what made you come forward amidst all these threats personally against you?
As Shahram said, I'm not the only one who's been threatened by the IRGC or by the Iranian regime, unfortunately. But I decided to go public because I know how this organization operates. It puts pressures on family members in Iran who are, in a way, you can say they are hostages, and uses them as a tool to silence Iranian dissidents abroad. The Iranian regime is like a wild animal, if you will. If they see or feel that you are feared of them, you are afraid of them, they will attack you. So I did not want to put my family through hell. So I decided to speak out. If I had been silenced about this, this would not be the end of it. They would call him and pressure him again to call me and ask for another thing, and then another thing, and then another thing. It would be demands after demands, and they would not leave him alone.
I think a lot of Canadians could actually empathize with your situation. Over 8 million Canadians trace their roots back to communist countries abroad, and these tactics don't sound very much different than in tyrannical communist countries. You mentioned Shahram earlier about the downed flight, the Ukrainian flight. Could you please just refresh our audience as to what happened with that flight? Because some people might have forgotten. It's with COVID, things have just been dominated so much by that issue lately. So please refresh us what happened there.
Yes. Flight 752, Ukrainian international flight, was originating from Tehran to Kiev. And then many, as you just mentioned just a bit earlier, most of actually its passengers were bounded for Canada, many of them Canadian citizens, many more permanent residents here in Canada, and few from other countries as well. Now, few minutes after its departure from Tehran, the plane was hit by missiles of the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Now, not once, but twice. Now, in the first few days, on January 8, 2020, so it's not even a year now, In the first few days, the Iranian regime denied completely from top to bottom. So it's not only one person, it's not only one organization. From the supreme leader to the president, to the head of the armed forces, to everyone involved. They say this is impossible. This has been a mechanical failure. Only after international pressure, and I would say even the US pressure, who have captured some of the scenes of the missiles attacking, basically, or hitting the plane, they came under immense pressure to admit that it was the missiles. But even now, after so many, I mean, they delayed the giving of the black boxes to the international authorities.
Right, I remember
They did not cooperate with the international community. In every occasion, they tried to basically hide all the facts. And even now,
Shahram, I'm sorry, we have to cut
they are hiding the
we have to cut to commercial break, but we're going to come right back to this discussion in a moment. Welcome back. Just before the break, we were discussing the downed Ukrainian flight 752 that was hit by 2 missiles just a few moments after it took off over Tehran. Shahram, you were discussing what has happened in terms of evidence, the black box. How has the Iranian regime cooperated? What has gone on?
They haven't cooperated at all. Again, under immense international pressure, finally, after a few months, they gave the black boxes. But already we knew that what the black boxes will basically tell us, because it was the missile. But the devastating point for the families, and I truly feel for all of them, is that even after the first missiles, I mean, voices could be heard from inside the cabin, inside the plane. And I guess during that few seconds, I would say 19 to 24 seconds after the first missile that hit the plane, how basically they lived in hell. I can't imagine how those passengers felt during that. So a few seconds after even the voices were heard, it was only, I believe, after the 19 seconds that the second missiles hit, or the 24 seconds after the first one, that you couldn't hear anything. But this is not the issue. The issue is that the Iranian regime does not cooperate of even the chain of command that led to that disaster. They try to basically buy the blood of the victims by giving some compensation. Of course, compensation would be part of it, but it's much more than that. And I'm very glad that the Association of the Families of the Victims have not given up of finding the true situation and basically holding Iran accountable for what it has happened, and this is what we are pushing for.
Okay, Narges, I want to discuss the victims because there were 55 Canadian citizens on that plane, and so we'll do that in just a moment. But has the Iranian government owned up? I thought there was some discussion, or I thought at one point they released a statement saying, yes, this is what happened, there were missiles and it was an error. Are we buying what they're selling?
Actually, as Shahram said, they were silenced in the beginning and they denied it, actually.
Right.
But after other leaders of other countries started to pressure the regime and tell them that this was deliberate act against the passengers, they decided to go with it and said, yes, we did that. But they actually want to punish one person, the person who pushed the trigger. This is not right. I mean, the person who I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Ordered.
Yeah, the person who
give the instruction. Yeah.
Exactly. The person who ordered the action has to be accountable, has to be held accountable. But higher than that, I think Khamenei, the supreme leader, is the person who is responsible for this, because under his rule, if he doesn't say, nothing goes. Everything goes on his order, so under his order. So he's the one who has to be responsible. The Iranian regime has to be responsible. And I was very, very sad, actually, and very disappointed to see Honorable Trudeau condoling Javad Zarif, Iranian regime's foreign minister, for this disaster. And I mean, I could see I saw the pictures. Javad Zarif was laughing, which was very, very disgusting. But Trudeau was kneeling, was actually on his bending over for Zarif, which was very disappointing. Instead of pressuring the regime to give the black box, they go and condole the regime. You shouldn't condole the regime. They are responsible for this disaster. So
I guess based on what I'm hearing, Shahram, you think that the Canadian response to this downed air flight 752 is lacking?
I would say definitely. I actually heard even Mr. Trudeau's speech at the UN General Assembly, and part of it was referring to inaction of the UN with respect to, he didn't name Iran, but he mentioned a country that downs a passenger's plane. So I would imagine he was referring to the Ukrainian flight. But I would go one step further. Everything starts at home. We have to take actions first in Canada with so many victims, blood in the basically their blood spilled, and we have to take responsibility of following the demand and the wishes of the families to take Iran accountable.
We're gonna talk about what we can we're gonna talk about what we can expect from the Canadian government right when we return from this commercial break. Welcome back. We're discussing the downed Iranian or Ukrainian flight over Iranian soil 752 and its victims. Before the break, Shahram, you were mentioning the actions you'd like to see the government take. What has been the response, again, from the government? And what are the victims' families saying here in Canada? Because there were 55 Canadians aboard, and any loss of life is catastrophic. But, you know, as Canadians, we're concerned about our own citizens as well.
Absolutely. And I would say, unfortunately, the government responds, although with many sympathetic words from both Minister of Transport, Mr. Garneau, and also Ralph Goode, who has been appointed by the government as special rep from the Canadian government to deal with this issue. But they both, unfortunately, I guess, are not pushing hard enough to get to the bottom of this and to give the families a chance to heal basically from this disaster. They would never recover. The lost lives, unfortunately, cannot come back. But what we can do is, at least as many family members have said, try to prevent future ones by holding the Iranian regime accountable. I would bet that if even a similar act had been happening in any even semi-democratic country, the whole situation would be much different. We would have seen cases in the International Criminal Court. We would have seen cases in front of the international tribunals. We would have seen tons of activities around it. Yes, you mentioned about the COVID-19. That definitely had an impact from every aspect of life, from, I guess, everyone around the globe. But that should not leave us to leave basically those families alone.
Right.
And it's not only them. If we go back even from Zahra Kazemi's case, who was a Canadian photojournalist tortured in Iranian prison.
Oh, and recently,
many
Narges,
more cases.
yes,
like
Narges,
that.
maybe you can comment. Recently, in the town of Markham, Ontario, a known Iranian dissenter, a Canadian here, was murdered. What has been the implication in that situation?
I think police are still. Were you addressing me or Shahram?
Sorry, Narges, please go ahead.
I think the police are still investigating in that regard, but I wouldn't be surprised if Iranian regime had a hand in that, because Iranian regime has a record. In the 1990s, they assassinate Iranian dissidents in Europe. More than 100 people have been assassinated by the Iranian regime. But you know, the Canadian government, they shut down the embassy of Iranian regime in 2012.
Right.
Excellent.
Yes, we don't have current diplomatic relations with Iran. That's correct.
That's excellent, because we had relations with the Iranian regime before Zahra Kazemi, as Shahram mentioned, in 2003. See what happens. They couldn't even bring home Zahra's body to her son in Montreal. So diplomacy with this regime does not work because they do not play the rules. You know, they do not play by the rules.
Recently during COVID, we mentioned COVID kind of distracted it quite a bit, but there was a famous Iranian wrestler who was executed in the public streets, I believe. Can you, in the 1 minute we have left, just explain quickly what happened? Narges?
Yeah. Actually,
Shahram,
I guess
go ahead.
One comment. No, Nargis will continue. But one comment is that the wrestler was from the same city as Nargis was. So I guess Nargis can comment on that quite well. Go ahead, Nargis.
We only have 30 seconds left.
Okay, he was a champion wrestler actually, and he was in jail for a few years because he spoke out against the regime. They killed him. Despite all the efforts of the whole world, actually, they were ruling for him to be free, to at least not to be executed. But this regime is ruthless. You cannot play along with this regime. You cannot open a dialogue with this regime. Talking with this regime doesn't work.
And on that note,
what I want from the Canadian government, I just have to say this. We want the Canadian government to list IRGC as a terrorist organization. We want them to list MOIS as a terrorist organization, because we are living in Canada and we have to live in fear, not for ourselves so much, but for our families back home. You know, so I think Canadian government has a responsibility to actually do this, because they passed a motion in 2018, the Canadian Parliament, to list the IRGC, and we want them to do that. I don't know what Honorable Trudeau is waiting for.
Well, we're going to have to wait and see what is going to happen in the coming days, months ahead with respect to Iran and Canadian relations. But one thing's for sure, Canadians are being threatened here on Canadian soil. For Counterpoint, I'm Tanya Granick-Allen.